The Atlanta County Courthouse stood tall and imposing on a warm Tuesday morning in September. The marble floors echoed with footsteps as people made their way through security checkpoints and metal detectors, heading to their designated courtrooms. Among them was Michael Barrett, a 45-year-old real estate developer known for his expensive suits and arrogant demeanor. Courtroom 305 belonged to Judge Marcus Washington, a highly respected figure in the legal community who had served on the bench for over 15 years. His reputation for fairness and wisdom preceded him, earning him numerous accolades throughout his career. The journey to his position hadn't been easy. He had overcome countless obstacles and prejudices to become one of the most prominent African American judges in the state. As Barrett strutted into the courtroom that morning, his expensive Italian leather shoes clicking against the floor, several heads turned. He carried himself with an air of superiority that immediately caught the attention of Officer Sarah Chen, one of the court officers on duty. She had worked in this courtroom long enough to recognize trouble when she saw it. "All rise," announced the bailiff as Judge Washington entered the courtroom. Everyone stood respectfully. Everyone except Barrett, who remained seated, casually checking his phone. Officer Chen stepped forward, clearing her throat loudly. Barrett looked up, rolling his eyes before slowly rising to his feet. Judge Washington took his seat, his dark robes settling around him as he adjusted his reading glasses. The morning docket was fairly routine. Traffic violations, minor disputes, and a few misdemeanors. Barrett's case was third on the list, a series of parking violations and one incident of running a red light, all of which he had consistently refused to pay. Case number 2023 TR 456, City of Atlanta versus Michael Barrett, called out the court clerk. Barrett sauntered to the podium, his body language showing complete disinterest in the proceedings. Judge Washington noticed this immediately but maintained his professional composure. "Mr. Barrett," Judge Washington began, his voice clear and authoritative, "you have accumulated multiple parking violations over the past 6 months. And there's also the matter of running a red light at the intersection of Peachtree and 14th Street. How do you plead?" Barrett smirked, leaning casually against the podium. "Whatever you say, Your Honor. This whole thing is just a joke anyway." His voice dripped with sarcasm, causing several gasps from the gallery. The judge's expression remained neutral, though his eyes narrowed slightly. "Mr. Barrett, I remind you that you are in a court of law. Your behavior should reflect the seriousness of these proceedings." "Oh, come on," Barrett replied, waving his hand dismissively. "You're quite the comedian, aren't you? Making such a big deal out of a few parking tickets. I got better things to do than waste my time here." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. The court reporter's fingers froze over her keyboard, and Officer Chen's hand instinctively moved closer to her belt. The other spectators in the courtroom shifted uncomfortably in their seats, sensing the building tension. Judge Washington slowly removed his reading glasses, placing them carefully on the bench before him. His years of experience had taught him to handle difficult situations with grace, but there was something particularly challenging about this moment. The disrespect wasn't just aimed at his position as a judge. There was an underlying tone that spoke to something deeper and more personal. "Mr. Barrett," Judge Washington spoke, his voice measured and controlled, "would you care to rephrase your statement?" Barrett glanced around the courtroom, apparently enjoying the attention he was receiving. "Why should I? This whole thing is just entertainment, isn't it? You sitting up there in your fancy robe, playing at being important." The court clerk's jaw dropped, and Officer Chen took a step forward. But Judge Washington raised his hand slightly, signaling them to hold their positions. The silence in the courtroom was deafening as everyone waited to see how the judge would respond to this blatant display of disrespect. What nobody in the courtroom knew at that moment was that this routine traffic violation hearing was about to become one of the most talked about cases in the county's recent history. Judge Washington's response to Barrett's behavior would not only teach a powerful lesson about respect and dignity, it would also challenge deep-seated prejudices that still lingered in the justice system. The stage was set for what would become a memorable example of how justice, wisdom, and dignity could triumph over ignorance and disrespect. The tension in courtroom 305 was thick enough to cut with a knife. Judge Washington's expression remained calm, but there was a subtle change in his posture as he leaned forward slightly in his chair. The years of experience on his face told stories of similar encounters, though perhaps none quite as brazen as this. Mr. Barrett, Judge Washington began, his voice carrying the weight that commanded attention. In my 15 years on this bench, I have seen many individuals stand where you're standing. Some were genuinely remorseful, others were frustrated, but all of them understood one fundamental truth: this court deserves respect. Barrett's smirk only grew wider. He adjusted his designer tie and let out a short, dismissive laugh. Respect? For what? A few parking tickets? Come on, tell another joke. You're really good at this comedy thing. The racial undertone in Barrett's words wasn't lost on anyone in the courtroom. Several spectators shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others watched with mounting concern. Officer Chen's partner, Officer Rodriguez, moved closer to the defendant's position, sensing the escalating situation. Judge Washington calmly picked up a folder from his bench. Let's review your record, Mr. Barrett. It seems these aren't just a few parking tickets. We have 8 violations in high-priority zones, including blocking emergency vehicle access at Atlanta General Hospital. There's also the matter of running a red light at a school crossing during peak hours. Those zones are ridiculous, Barrett interrupted, waving his hand dismissively. Just another way for the system to make money. And that red light? The sun was in my eyes. But please, continue with your performance. The audience seems to love it. At this point, the court clerk, Mrs. Thompson, who had served in this courtroom for over 2 decades, stopped typing entirely. Her hands hovered over the keyboard as she watched the scene unfold with growing disbelief. Judge Washington stood slowly, his 6'2" frame commanding the room. Mr. Barrett, let me be very clear. Your continued disrespect for this court and its proceedings leaves me no choice but to... No choice? Barrett cut in again, his voice louder now. Oh, this is the part where you try to scare me with your authority, right? Like some TV judge. Maybe you should consider a career in entertainment instead. You got the act down perfectly. The gallery erupted in hushed whispers. Judge Washington raised his gavel, bringing silence back to the courtroom with a single tap. His next words were delivered with deliberate precision. Mr. Barrett, you are now in contempt of court. Officer Chen, please take the defendant into custody. As Officer Chen moved forward, Barrett's smugness finally cracked. His face reddened, and for the first time that morning, genuine concern flashed across his features. Wait, what? You can't do this. I have meetings today, important ones. You will be held for 24 hours, Judge Washington continued, unmoved by Barrett's protests. During this time, you might want to reflect on the difference between entertainment and justice. When you return tomorrow, we will address both your original violations and your contempt charge. Barrett's expensive suit didn't look quite so impressive as Officer Chen secured his wrists behind his back. This is ridiculous, he sputtered, his earlier bravado evaporating. I'll call my lawyer, you'll hear from them. Your lawyer is welcome to attend tomorrow's hearing, Judge Washington replied calmly. Court officers, please escort Mr. Barrett to holding. We will resume this case tomorrow at 9 a.m. sharp. As Barrett was led away, his protests echoing down the hallway, Judge Washington remained standing. The courtroom was silent, every eye fixed on the distinguished judge who had handled the situation with remarkable restraint and dignity. Next case, he called out, adjusting his robes and sitting back down. But everyone present knew that tomorrow's hearing would be anything but ordinary. The news of Barrett's behavior and Judge Washington's response would spread quickly through the courthouse, drawing attention from other judges, lawyers, and court staff. What nobody realized yet was that Judge Washington had something much more instructive in mind than just a simple contempt charge. His years of experience had taught him that sometimes the most powerful lessons came not from punishment, but from understanding. As Barrett spent his night in holding, Judge Washington began formulating a plan that would transform this unfortunate incident into a meaningful lesson about respect, dignity, and justice. The holding cell was a stark contrast to Michael Barrett's usual surroundings. Gone were the plush leather chairs and mahogany desks of his corner office. Instead, he sat on a hard metal bench, his expensive suit wrinkled, and his normally perfect hair disheveled. The 24 hours in holding had given him plenty of time to think, though not necessarily to reflect. The next morning, the atmosphere in courtroom 305 was electric with anticipation. Word had spread quickly through the courthouse about the previous day's events, and the gallery was packed with curious onlookers, including several other judges and attorneys who had taken an early break from their own proceedings to witness what would happen next. Barrett's attorney, James Reynolds, arrived early, his briefcase clutched tightly in his hand. He was known for handling high-profile cases, but the look of concern on his face suggested he knew this situation was different. He had spent the evening reviewing the court transcripts from the previous day, and his client's behavior made him visibly uncomfortable. At exactly 9 a.m., the bailiff's voice rang out. "All rise, the Honorable Judge Marcus Washington presiding." This time, Barrett stood immediately, though his face still held traces of defiance. His night in holding hadn't completely erased his attitude, but there were cracks in his formerly impenetrable armor of arrogance. Judge Washington entered the courtroom, his movements deliberate and measured. He carried with him a thick folder that nobody had seen before. After taking his seat, he surveyed the crowded courtroom before focusing his attention on Barrett and his attorney. "Mr. Reynolds," Judge Washington began, "I see you've joined us today. I trust you've reviewed yesterday's proceedings?" Reynolds stood quickly. "Yes, Your Honor. First, I would like to apologize on behalf of my client for his behavior yesterday. We understand the seriousness of his actions and—" "Let me stop you there, Counselor," Judge Washington interrupted, raising his hand. "I believe your client should speak for himself. Mr. Barrett, would you like to address this court?" Barrett stepped forward, his lawyer whispering something in his ear. "Your Honor," he began, his voice lacking its previous sarcasm, but still holding a note of resistance. "I apologize if my behavior yesterday was inappropriate. I was frustrated and spoke without thinking." Judge Washington opened the folder before him. "Mr. Barrett, do you know what I have here?" Barrett shook his head, confusion crossing his face. "These are letters," the judge continued, "from various individuals who have appeared before me over the years. Some were defendants, some were victims, some were witnesses. But each one taught me something about justice, about humanity, and about the responsibility that comes with sitting on this bench." The courtroom fell silent as Judge Washington pulled out one particular letter. "This one is from a young man who stood where you're standing 5 years ago. He was angry, disrespectful, much like yourself, but his anger came from a place of pain, of feeling unheard and unseen by the system. What's your excuse, Mr. Barrett?" Barrett shifted uncomfortably, caught off guard by the personal nature of the question. His lawyer started to stand, but Judge Washington raised his hand again. "This isn't a legal question, Counselor. I'm asking your client about his perspective on justice and respect." For the first time since entering the courtroom the previous day, Barrett seemed genuinely at a loss for words. The judge's direct question had pierced through his carefully constructed facade of superiority. I don't have an excuse, Your Honor," Barrett finally admitted, his voice smaller than before. Judge Washington nodded slowly, then reached for another document on his bench. "Mr. Barrett, I've reviewed your case thoroughly, including your background. You built a successful real estate business, employed hundreds of people, and even contributed to various charities. Yet yesterday, you chose to treat this court, and by extension, the entire justice system, as a joke. More than that, you chose to bring race into it, albeit subtly." The tension in the courtroom increased as Judge Washington paused, letting his words sink in. What he would say next would not only address Barrett's contempt of court, but would also confront the deeper issues that had surfaced during this seemingly routine traffic violation hearing. The path to true understanding and respect was about to take an unexpected turn. Judge Washington removed his reading glasses and looked directly at Barrett. "What many people in this courtroom don't know," he began, "is that before I became a judge, I worked as a parking enforcement officer to put myself through law school." The revelation caused Barrett to blink in surprise, his usual smirk completely gone. The judge continued, his voice carrying throughout the silent courtroom. "Every day, I would write tickets for vehicles blocking emergency lanes, handicap spaces, and fire zones. One afternoon, I wrote a ticket for a car parked in an emergency lane at Atlanta General Hospital. 10 minutes later, a young mother came running out, crying. Her son had been rushed to the emergency room. She couldn't find parking anywhere else." Judge Washington paused, letting the weight of the story settle. "I could have simply enforced the law without consideration. Instead, I listened to her story, helped her find proper parking, and canceled the ticket. You see, Mr. Barrett, these aren't just rules written on paper. They affect real people. Barrett's attorney shifted in his chair, sensing where this was going. The gallery remained completely silent, hanging on every word. Your parking violations, the judge continued, picking up a document, include one from last month at that same hospital. The emergency room doctor on duty had to wait 3 minutes to get his car out because you were blocking the staff parking exit. 3 minutes might not seem like much to you, but in emergency medicine, it can mean the difference between life and death. Color drained from Barrett's face as the judge's words hit home. For the first time, he seemed to understand the real impact of his actions. But today, we're not just here about parking tickets or running red lights. Judge Washington continued. We're here because you chose to disrespect this court and what it represents. You saw me not as a judge, but as someone you could mock, someone whose authority you could dismiss with casual racism thinly veiled as humor. Several people in the gallery nodded in agreement. Officer Chen, standing at her usual post, watched Barrett's demeanor continue to crumble. Your Honor, Barrett's attorney interjected, my client is prepared to pay all fines and… Mr. Reynolds, Judge Washington interrupted firmly but politely, I appreciate your advocacy, but there are some things money cannot fix. Respect, dignity, and understanding aren't commodities that can be purchased. The judge stood up, his tall frame commanding attention. Mr. Barrett, I've spent the evening considering your case. I could simply fine you heavily for contempt and send you on your way. But that wouldn't address the root of the problem, would it? Barrett shook his head slowly, genuinely uncertain about what was coming next. Therefore, Judge Washington continued, I'm going to offer you a choice. Option 1, you can pay the maximum fine for all violations, including contempt of court, which totals $12,500. Option 2, you can spend the next 30 days working with the hospital's parking enforcement team, learning firsthand why these rules exist, followed by another 30 days observing court proceedings from the gallery. The choice is yours. The courtroom buzzed with whispered conversations. Barrett's attorney leaned over to whisper something in his client's ear, but Barrett waved him off. For the first time since this began, he looked directly at Judge Washington, not with arrogance or contempt, but with something approaching understanding. Your Honor, Barrett spoke, his voice noticeably different from the previous day. May I have a moment to consider my options? You may have until 2 p.m. today, Judge Washington replied. Return then with your decision. But remember this, whichever option you choose will become part of your permanent record, along with how you handle it. Court is in recess until 2 p.m. As the bailiff called for all to rise, Barrett remained rooted to his spot, staring at the floor. His carefully constructed world of privilege and dismissive attitude had been shaken to its core. As he left the courtroom with his attorney, everyone present knew that Judge Washington had done something remarkable. He had turned a simple traffic violation into a powerful lesson about respect, responsibility, and human dignity. The next few hours would determine not just Barrett's punishment, but potentially the course of his understanding of justice and equality. As people filed out of the courtroom, the anticipation of his afternoon decision hung heavy in the air. At precisely 2 p.m., courtroom 305 was once again filled to capacity. News of Judge Washington's unique sentencing options had spread throughout the courthouse, drawing even more spectators than the morning session. Legal clerks, attorneys, and courthouse staff found excuses to be present, all eager to witness Barrett's decision. Barrett sat quietly beside his attorney, his appearance markedly different from his previous court appearances. His designer suit, though still immaculate, seemed to weigh heavily on his shoulders. The past few hours had been spent in intense discussion with his lawyer in a small conference room, weighing his options and their implications. When Judge Washington entered the courtroom, the usual all-rise announcement felt more solemn than ever. The judge took his seat and immediately focused his attention on Barrett. Mr. Barrett, have you reached a decision regarding the options presented to you this morning? Barrett stood slowly, clearing his throat. His attorney remained seated, a clear indication that this response would be Barrett's alone. Yes, Your Honor, I have. The courtroom collectively held its breath. Even Officer Chen, who had seen countless defendants come and go, found herself leaning forward slightly. Before I give you my decision, Barrett continued, his voice lacking its previous arrogance, I'd like to share something, if the court permits. Judge Washington nodded, gesturing for him to proceed. During the recess, I called my mother, Barrett said, his voice slightly shaky. I told her about what happened here, about my behavior, about your options. She was silent for a long time. Then she told me something I'd never known. When I was born, she had complications. She survived because a doctor managed to reach the hospital in time, despite someone blocking the staff parking entrance. A murmur ran through the gallery. Judge Washington's expression remained neutral, but his eyes showed careful attention. She never told me this story before, Barrett continued. She said she was ashamed that her son had become someone who would do to others what almost cost her her life. Your Honor, I'd spent my life believing that rules were for other people, that my convenience mattered more than anyone else's needs. He paused, taking a deep breath. I choose option 2. Not because it might be easier than paying the fine. I know it won't be. I choose it because for the first time in my life, I want to understand the impact of my actions on others. Judge Washington leaned forward slightly. Mr. Barrett, are you sure about this decision? The next 60 days will not be easy. You'll be expected to work full shifts with the parking enforcement team, witnessing firsthand the consequences of violations like yours. Following that, you'll spend your days observing court proceedings, seeing justice from a different perspective. I'm sure, Your Honor, Barrett replied firmly. And I want to apologize, truly apologize, for my behavior yesterday. My comments were not just disrespectful to this court, they were— he struggled for words. They were racist, and I'm ashamed of them. The courtroom fell silent. Judge Washington studied Barrett for a long moment before speaking. Mr. Barrett, recognizing our faults is the first step toward correcting them. Your 60 days begin tomorrow. You will report to the Atlanta General Hospital Parking Enforcement Office at 7 a.m. Officer Chen will provide you with the necessary documentation and instructions before you leave today. The judge picked up his gavel but paused before bringing it down. One more thing, Mr. Barrett. During your time observing this court, I expect you to keep a detailed journal of your experiences and observations. This isn't about punishment. It's about understanding the humanity behind every case that comes before this bench. Barrett nodded solemnly. I understand, Your Honor. Very well. Court is adjourned. The gavel fell with a decisive crack. As people began filing out of the courtroom, many noticed something different about Barrett's demeanor. The arrogant businessman who had strutted in the day before was gone, replaced by someone who seemed to be seeing the world through new eyes. Officer Chen approached him with a folder of documents, and for the first time, Barrett looked at her with respect. Thank you, officer, he said quietly, accepting the papers. What nobody in the courtroom could predict was how these next 60 days would not only transform Barrett, but would also become a talking point throughout the legal community about alternative approaches to justice and rehabilitation. The real education was about to begin. The first morning of Barrett's parking enforcement duty arrived with a gray, drizzling rain. He stood in the hospital parking lot at 6:55 a.m., wearing practical clothes instead of his usual suits, feeling distinctly out of place. Sarah Martinez, the head of parking enforcement at Atlanta General, greeted him with a no-nonsense expression. Mr. Barrett, welcome to the real world, she said, handing him a bright yellow safety vest. Your shift starts in 5 minutes. Today, you'll be shadowing James, our senior enforcement officer. James Turner turned out to be a man in his 60s, with kind eyes and weathered hands that had written thousands of tickets over his 20-year career. He didn't waste time with small talk, immediately leading Barrett on their first round. See that car there? James pointed to a Mercedes parked across 2 handicap spaces. Looks expensive, probably belongs to someone who thinks rules don't apply to them. Remind you of anyone? Barrett felt his face flush with shame, remembering his own past behavior. As they approached the vehicle, a woman in a wheelchair was trying to maneuver around it, struggling to reach her own properly parked car. Excuse me, James called out, rushing to help the woman. Let me assist you, Mrs. Johnson. Barrett watched as James helped the elderly woman, noting how he knew her name and treated her with genuine respect. It was the first of many lessons he would learn that day. By noon, Barrett's feet ached, and his notebook was filled with observations. He watched James deal with angry drivers, emotional family members, and medical emergencies. Each situation was handled with a mixture of firmness and compassion that Barrett had never considered possible in this line of work. The turning point came during their afternoon shift. An ambulance arrived with sirens blaring, but had to slow down because a sports car was partially blocking the emergency entrance. Those extra seconds felt like hours as paramedics rushed to get their patient inside. "That patient is someone's loved one," James said quietly, watching Barrett's face. "Every second we save by keeping these lanes clear could mean the difference between life and death." Later that day, they encountered a young mother crying beside her car, which was parked in a no-parking zone. Her story was eerily similar to the one Judge Washington had shared. A sick child, no available parking, a moment of desperation. James handled the situation with remarkable grace, helping the woman find proper parking while explaining the importance of keeping emergency lanes clear. Barrett watched, remembering his own violations and their potential consequences. "You know," James said as they walked back to the office at the end of their shift, "most people think we enjoy writing tickets. They don't see that we're just trying to keep people safe, to make sure emergency vehicles can get through, to protect those who need these spaces most." Barrett nodded, his designer watch feeling strangely heavy on his wrist. "I was one of those people," he admitted. "I never thought about the reasons behind the rules." As he prepared to leave for the day, Barrett caught sight of himself in a window reflection. The yellow safety vest over his casual clothes painted a very different picture from his usual polished appearance, but somehow he felt more genuine than he had in years. Before heading home, he took a moment to write in the journal Judge Washington had required. Day 1. Today I learned that every parking space has a story. Every rule has a reason. The Mercedes I used to drive, the rules I used to break, they weren't just about me. They were about Mrs. Johnson in her wheelchair, about the emergency vehicles needing clear access, about the desperate mother with a sick child. James showed me that enforcement isn't about power or punishment, it's about protecting people. As Barrett drove home that evening, he found himself noticing things he'd never seen before. The carefully marked emergency lanes, the strategic placement of handicap spaces, the clear signs indicating parking rules. For the first time, he saw them not as inconveniences to be ignored, but as essential parts of a system designed to help people. What he didn't know yet was that this was just the beginning of his transformation. The coming days would challenge his perspectives even further, and the lessons would extend far beyond parking regulations into deeper understandings of privilege, respect, and human dignity. 30 days passed quickly at Atlanta General Hospital, each day bringing new insights and humbling experiences for Michael Barrett. On his final day of parking enforcement duty, he found himself standing in the same spot where he had started, but he was no longer the same person. The second phase of his court-mandated education was about to begin, 30 days of observing court proceedings. As Barrett entered courtroom 305 on the first morning, he took his seat in the gallery with a different perspective than he'd had during his own case. Judge Washington acknowledged his presence with a slight nod before beginning the day's proceedings. Barrett opened his journal, ready to observe and learn, just as he had done during his time at the hospital. The first case involved a young man caught shoplifting food. Instead of immediately passing judgment, Judge Washington asked about the defendant's circumstances. The story that emerged was one of poverty and desperation. A single father trying to feed his children after losing his job. "Your Honor," Barrett found himself speaking up suddenly, surprising everyone in the courtroom. "May I approach?" Judge Washington raised an eyebrow but nodded his permission. Barrett walked forward, his heart pounding. "I own several businesses in the area," he said. "I could offer this man a job, if the court permits." The young defendant looked up in shock, hope flickering across his tired face. Judge Washington's expression remained neutral, but there was a glimmer of approval in his eyes. "Mr. Thompson," he addressed the defendant, "would you be interested in this opportunity?" The young man nodded vigorously, tears forming in his eyes. Judge Washington structured a sentence that included employment with Barrett, restitution payments, and community service. It was the first of many instances where Barrett would witness justice being served with wisdom and compassion. As the days progressed, Barrett's journal filled with observations that went far beyond legal proceedings. He wrote about the court officers who treated everyone with respect, regardless of their circumstances. He noted how Judge Washington listened to each case with full attention, whether it was a major felony or a minor violation. One particularly memorable day, a familiar face appeared in court. The elderly woman in the wheelchair, Mrs. Johnson, whom he had met during his parking enforcement duty. She was there as a character witness for her grandson. When she spotted Barrett, she smiled and waved, remembering him from his time helping at the hospital. During a recess, Mrs. Johnson approached him. "You know," she said softly, "when I first met you, you reminded me of the people who used to park in handicap spaces without thinking about others. But watching you today, helping that young father, you've changed." Barrett felt his throat tighten with emotion. "Thank you," he managed to say. "I needed to change." On the 29th day of his court observation, Barrett witnessed something that brought his entire experience full circle. A businessman, not unlike himself 2 months ago, came before Judge Washington with multiple parking violations and a contemptuous attitude. Barrett watched the scene unfold, seeing his former self in the defendant's arrogant stance and dismissive tone. But instead of feeling superiority or judgment, he felt sadness for the man's blindness to his own privilege and the impact of his actions. During the lunch recess that day, Judge Washington called Barrett into his chambers. "Tomorrow will be your last day here," the judge said, gesturing for Barrett to sit. "I've read your daily journals. They show significant reflection and growth." Barrett nodded, choosing his words carefully. "Your Honor, these 60 days have taught me more than any fine could have. I've learned that justice isn't just about rules and punishments. It's about understanding, compassion, and responsibility." Judge Washington smiled slightly. "And what do you plan to do with these lessons, Mr. Barrett?" "I'm implementing new policies at my companies," Barrett replied. "Priority parking for emergency vehicles and handicap spaces at all my properties. Free legal aid for employees, and I'm starting a foundation to help people like that young father we saw today." As Barrett prepared to leave the judge's chambers, he turned back one last time. "Thank you, Your Honor, not just for teaching me about respect for the law, but for showing me what true justice looks like." The transformation that had begun with a parking ticket and contempt of court was now complete. But its ripple effects were just beginning to spread through the community. 1 year later, courtroom 305 was packed for a special session. Judge Marcus Washington sat at his bench, reviewing a familiar folder while the gallery filled with an unusual mix of people. In the front row sat Sarah Martinez and James Turner from Hospital Parking Enforcement, alongside Mrs. Johnson in her wheelchair. Behind them were several of Barrett's employees, and scattered throughout were many faces that had been part of cases Barrett had witnessed during his court observation days. Michael Barrett entered the courtroom, not as a defendant this time, but as an invited speaker. The past year had transformed him in ways visible to everyone who knew him. His expensive suit remained, but his demeanor carried a humility and awareness that no designer label could provide. "The court calls Michael Barrett," Judge Washington announced, his voice carrying the same authority it had that first day, but now with an undertone of satisfaction. Barrett approached the podium, pulling out a worn journal, the same one he had used during his 60 days of learning. "Your Honor," he began, "1 year ago, I stood in this spot as a different person. Today, I'm here to share what that transformation has meant, not just for me, but for our community." He opened his journal and began to read. "In the past year, our foundation has provided legal aid to over 200 families. We've created a partnership with Atlanta General Hospital to build a new parking structure, ensuring adequate spaces for emergency vehicles and those with disabilities. The young father who needed a job that day in court. He's now a manager at one of our locations, helping others who were in his situation." Barrett turned to face the gallery. "But the numbers don't tell the whole story. The real change has been in understanding that justice and compassion go hand in hand. Every morning, I park my car and walk past the emergency lanes I once blocked, and I think about the lives that might depend on those few feet of clear space." Mrs. Johnson wheeled herself forward. "If I may, Your Honor." Judge Washington nodded, and she continued. "Mr. Barrett's foundation helped my grandson get through college. He graduates next month with a degree in social work. One person's change created ripples that touched so many lives." James Turner stood next. "The parking enforcement training program Mr. Barrett helped us develop has changed how our officers interact with the public. We're not just writing tickets anymore, we're building understanding." Judge Washington listened to each testimony, his expression thoughtful. When the last speaker finished, he turned to Barrett. "Mr. Barrett, when I gave you those two options a year ago, I hoped for change. but you've exceeded those hopes. You've taken a lesson about parking violations and turned it into a movement for community improvement. Barrett nodded humbly. Your Honor, you taught me that true justice isn't about punishment, it's about transformation. Every day, I try to live up to that lesson. The judge reached for his gavel but paused. The purpose of today's session was to document the long-term effects of alternative sentencing and community involvement in our justice system. Mr. Barrett's case will serve as a model for future cases, showing that justice can be both firm and compassionate. As the session concluded, people gathered around Barrett, sharing stories and plans for future initiatives. The courtroom that had once witnessed his worst behavior now saw him at his best, humble, engaged, and dedicated to making a difference. Outside the courthouse, Barrett stopped to help an elderly man who was struggling to find a parking space. As he guided the man to an appropriate spot, he caught his reflection in a car window. The face looking back at him showed the lines of experience and wisdom that hadn't been there a year ago. His phone buzzed with a message. Another family needed legal aid, another opportunity to help. Barrett smiled, remembering Judge Washington's words about justice and transformation. His journey had started with a parking ticket and contempt of court, but it had led to something far more meaningful, a deep understanding of respect, dignity, and the power of second chances. As he walked back to his office, Barrett passed the spot where he had once parked illegally. The emergency lane was clear, the handicap spaces were properly used, and the community he had once dismissed was now one he proudly served. It was a reminder that sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest moments of accountability.